Hello, everyone. Hi. I know this is not typically a cybersecurity venue, but I hope we might bring some interesting aspects of cybersecurity and AI to some of you folks out there. My name is Michael Melore. I'm a cybersecurity advisor with IBM, and I'm an evangelist of non-sales educational programs that are intended to cultivate relationships, showcases IBM stewardship in cybersecurity. And Keenan?
Keenan Skelly. I'm currently the CEO of a threat intelligence company called ShadowByte. I'm also on a variety of councils that deal in the area, Accenture councils, government councils that deal directly with how intelligence is impacting, the picture when we start talking about things like supply chain and all of those really difficult things that we're trying to juggle right now after the Solarium Commission. I'm also on the board of directors for Women's Society of Cyber Jutsu, and for whatever reason, somehow I founded the VC ISAC a few months ago.
Thanks, Keenan. Keenan and I are also members of a national security WeDram club. So sometimes we have a beverage together online on our weekly meetings. So anyway, nice to have all of you here. AI, certainly there's a lot of opportunities around AI. We could see some of the aspects here. 120 billion hours a year organizations are spending on low value work. So that's also in security as well. But we at IBM like to call it augmented intelligence, not artificial intelligence, because it's really assisting the analyst, the security analyst, in their day-to-day jobs. If you think about some of the triaging that the analysts have to do on a regular basis, they're getting slammed by events that are just flowing nonstop to them, and they have to decipher those events and prioritize them. And pretty much they are asking themselves over and over again: Is this real? Is it not real? Is it something I can handle? Is it beyond my skill set? Is anyone else experiencing similar symptoms to what I'm seeing? If it is real, is there remediation information around or remediation steps available? So, and they're asking themselves this over and over again, and everybody wants to do the right thing, but you think, these humans that are doing that, they might be on the top of their game at 10:30 in the morning on a Monday, and in prioritizing these events that are slamming them, and then on a Friday, 4:30, they might, not intentionally, but maybe view something as not a high priority. So, which maybe it is. And when you start bringing in AI and machine learning aspects where they're presented with a hypothesis, and it's telling them, yes, it is real. Here's what it is. Here's the bad actors that are throwing this on you, and here's the remediation information all in one swoop. It's a game changer. So, Keenan?
So I agree that it's a game changer. However, and I apologize. I'm kidding. I don't apologize. We might argue a little bit during this. When you talk about SOC analysts and really trying to take away a lot of those menial tasks that they don't really have to do, that's all fine and great, except that the SOC analysts also have to understand the limitations of the AI and what type of AI they're being introduced to and what that's actually doing for them. I've worked for a couple of companies where we've used NLP and deep learning to do conversational AI, right? To try to educate, for example, educate an in-game advisor to teach cybersecurity folks how to either do defense or red teaming. And what gets interesting is everyone thinks that cybersecurity is very straightforward in how it's presented and how it's done, right? It's just a simple set of tasks. But that's actually not the case. every cybersecurity person, every cybersecurity analyst, every threat intelligence analyst does it differently. It's an art form. It's something that's unique to that individual. Now, there may be prescriptive things you have to do with a specific tool, but that doesn't mean you have to use that tool. It doesn't mean you have to think inside this box. And this is where it gets really interesting when you start trying to train these models, these AI models, to really get the depth and breadth of the art form that is cybersecurity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. The traditional security incident and event management systems that most organizations have, sometimes they're referred to the organization's advanced analytics. They're based on the world according to them, for the most part. So I think any of the systems that could hold their weight in salt should at least identify patient zero and who may be communicated to them. But they're aggregating all of that information world according to the policyholders in those organizations. So first of all, they're picking and choosing which systems they're going to accept logs from and aggregate and normalize those logs, and then and interrogate those logs to try to decipher and try to then now compare them with rules and policies. Where the gaps are on those rules and policies are that someone, for the most part, is defining what the triggers should be. So if they're missing those triggers, they're not defining those right. And that's where cognitive comes in and starts saying, hey, providing that assistance to these folks. And in some cases, some of the tooling can say, well, you haven't created a rule or a policy for this particular situation, but 90% of the others that are using this tooling have thought it valuable to incorporate this policy and rule in there. So there's some assistance that could be happening from that perspective as well.
Absolutely. I think that it gets really challenging, especially in a topic as broad as cybersecurity, when we talk about using machine learning or deep learning or variations of AI. Aside from them being kind of artists in my mind, and I say that just because I'm one of them and I want to be an artist, right? But aside from those things, it's also about how you want the data to work for you. So as the CEO of a threat intelligence company and someone who spent a lot of time really dealing with threat actors at a very, very up close and personal, kind of way, it's being able to track the kinds of conversations that criminals are having in the underground, in the dark web, in all of this, which when you're trying to train an AI model to do profiling or even prediction as we start moving forward, I think next year, for example, the prediction piece is really going to blow up within cybersecurity, and you're already seeing companies doing that like Darktrace and others. And that's wonderful, but again, it goes back to how you're going to get that data and what kind of data it is. So for my company, for example, we are very deep into forums. We're very deep into forums across, the world. And if you've ever been in these forums, people talk weird. Okay, it's not like, hey, we're going to attack IBM today, and this is what we're using, and blah 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 blah. It's all shorthand, kid punk speak with like LOLs and blah, blah, blahs and blah, blah, blahs. So how do you train your AI model or your machine learning model to actually take that kind of random language with multiple actual languages around the world and get it to do something predictive in a space that is totally unpredictable? But that's exactly what's starting to happen, and that's exactly where this is going to go to the next level, I think, in the next year or so. Quantum is now pushing AI a lot further in this space. And when you let's think about social media data of any kind, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or anything like that. That's a massive amount of user data, right? It's the same thing with the dark web, massive global amounts of data. So we have that available to us, but really capturing, creating those policies, creating the rules, creating a learning environment for the AI where it can actually grow beyond just looking at the problem and alerting, but also predicting the trends among these users.
So on the threat hunting, so I think that's a new frontier for organizations. There's a few industries that kind of started embracing the physical logical security. And I was in, even a startup for a while. And it was really difficult to sell to a number of organizations because you couldn't really find the right folks to pitch the premise to. Because you had the chief security officers that were mostly focused on physical security, the perimeter and the badging systems, visitor management, and so forth. And you had the chief information security officers that typically reported to the CIO. But again, it was all about information, and they were very siloed in those organizations. The few industries that were around were transportation industry that were kind of getting it, and energy and utilities. With bringing that physical logical security, but financial institutions and pretty much almost everyone else. We were starting to see some of that maybe in maybe life sciences too, where they would have folks wearing different I forgot those surgical clothes. I forgot the term that they use on there.
Scrubs.
But they might have the scrubs, yeah. So they would have different colors. So if you were doing maybe animal testing, then you wore one particular color, and human trials were a different color. So if those folks ever walked into the wrong room, everyone would know. But for the most part, physical logical, are you seeing that that's more evolving and people are getting that now?
Yeah, I've actually seen that quite a bit, and more in the financial institution specifically. And I think that's been driven a lot by what's called the FS-ISAC. And I don't know how familiar the audience is with these types of things, but the FS-ISAC is just a group of financial services, financial systems, banks that get together and they talk about all the threats that they're seeing. When you have an environment like that, this is where AI can really shine. If you're getting trends and data analysis from multiple organizations in one sector, then it starts to provide much more clarity on the information and the data that you want to extract in your models. So in threat intelligence specifically, once we have this larger conglomerate of sort of, an entire industry, and they're communicating well with each other and sharing data, then that becomes even better for the type of model that you're trying to get. But there's still organizations, there's still sectors that are kind of lagging behind in that coordination. And honestly, this is something we've all seen for years and years and years. Nobody wants to share their proprietary data. Nobody wants to share that they've been breached. Nobody wants to share anything because they're afraid of ending up on CNN or the Washington Post and having them kind of, put in the spotlight. I have this thing that I'm really pushing right now, and it drives me crazy, but we as a community need to normalize the breach, because not only are we looking into artificial intelligence to deal with these kind of situations, but the enemy is too. They are using AI attacks against us all the time. So that's something that's really important. We have to get rid of the stigma in the United States and anywhere that being breached is awful, and shaming people that get breached and shaming the company and throwing fines at them, because that's not going to change anything. We need to embrace the culture that you're gonna get hacked. You're going to get hacked. When you do get hacked, these are the things that we can put in place for you. And I think AI plays a key part in that. Mm-hmm. Once they're not afraid anymore, once they're not afraid of everything that comes with being breached, once their lawyers can focus on other things, once their people can focus on other things like remediation, that's where this becomes a real game changer to me.
And so what kind of skills are they using to hire the folks that are those threat hunters? Where are they coming from? So
in my experience, mostly human people. At least that's how we focus on it, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of people will focus on reviewing and breaking down the malware and following the technical trail. But that doesn't absolve the use for the human, which often is the catalyst that's going to drive that technological advance. Mm-hmm. We do that very, very closely. We work very deep with very specific threat actors and use them and their conversations to automate and do deep learning to understand how these have relationships with each other. So often, if you think about ransomware, for example, often what happens is these ransomware groups are made up of multiple actors from other areas, right? They keep talking about in the news the ransomware kind of conglomeration or corporations that are on the dark web right now, which is really fascinating. But if you're studying from the very lowest level of the threat actors themselves, you can start to see where they're popping up in other attacks on that ransomware as a service kind of platform. So using artificial intelligence to really analyze the threat actors' engagements with different ransomware groups has provided some very useful information on all of the related attacks that are really happening globally, which I think is fascinating.
And I guess you have negotiators too. So I had a conversation with someone recently, and they said their small outfit was actually negotiating between 100 and 200 ransomware payouts on a monthly basis. So and they're using folks that are maybe retired law enforcement that are skilled, maybe FBI agents and all, formerly that are now doing the negotiations on behalf. And in fact, I think you're probably best suited to have some of these folks, do the negotiations on your behalf. In many cases, they'll negotiate that significantly lower than where the starting point was. So those bad actors that you say keep popping up, I'm assuming many of them probably refaced the same negotiators over again as well.
Absolutely. And we experience that quite often. So we do provide that kind of ransomware negotiation piece where typically how this kind of unfolds is someone, we're in a chat forum and somebody starts talking about they're selling this data that they got. And that's really just the beginning of the conversation, right? You really have to get in and become friends with them and become, kind of a trusted source so that they can talk about their payload and talk about how they're doing all of these things. When that gets really interesting, and you can finally get to a point where they're either testing or about to deploy something on a particular company, that's when we would reach out to the company and say, listen, we're dealing directly with the threat actor. We know from our analysis that he's a part of these 4 other organizations, and 2 of them have attacked you previously. So this could include, some old data. And then work with them to actually negotiate with the threat actor to bring what could be a $2 million ransom down to $50K. Because at the end of the day, a lot of these are kids. A lot of these are young people who just want the money or the sensationalism of it. But this also works to our advantage if you're doing artificial intelligence scraping for that, right? Because the ones who start getting to the point where they make their own wiki page and they do all of these other kinds of very flamboyant things to get attention, that's great. Keep doing that. Because it makes it easier for us to create those kind of models that allow for identification, relationship management, relationship kind of a threat picture of relationships globally.
So these bad actors, when they see you guys, oh, that's Keenan's firm doing the negotiations. Darn it. All right, let's move on to another target over here. Good.
Yeah, it's an interesting approach to this. And, going back to the AI piece of this, where I really see the benefit of using this kind of actor-specific thing is that often these organizations are involved in other things, right? They're probably not just doing the ransomware. They probably have other teams that they're on that are, creating malware and selling it and doing things of this nature. So it's also really good for identification of threat actors and what their capabilities are. And again, once you build those relationships and you understand that, okay, this group right here typically doesn't deploy their own malware. They always buy it from this group over here, and we can adjudicate from that using ML, deep learning, and AI. We can adjudicate from that what other ventures they're into. Now, like I said in the beginning, I think this is really crucial and game-changing when we start talking about supply chain management. I was on a call earlier today for a threat intelligence and supply chain panel, and it was fascinating to hear. We had a bunch of threat intel teams on talking about how we're all trying to kind of manage this. But really the best way to get a grip on this is, understanding your inventory first. And what helps you understand your inventory? Cataloging, really knowing who your suppliers are, really knowing all of that very complex data that's just hard to do anyway, especially if you're a really big company like IBM or Microsoft that has hundreds of thousands of companies that are involved in their supply chain. So something else that we're starting to see in the threat intelligence space is these larger organizations actually creating an agreement with all of their third-party folks that they can monitor their security systems as well. Now, they don't have to take any remediation on that, but if something is found, they will recommend you to a third-party vendor, somebody that's on their approved vendor list to actually help take care of that. And I think that's really fascinating, especially if we're trying to apply, kind of artificial intelligence to that.
You mentioned something.
I see you keep shaking your head. You're going to have questions.
You mentioned something about the purchasing the malware. Maybe some of this audience, they're maybe not so familiar with that. Could you maybe elaborate on that and how these bad actors operate and all?
Yeah, sure. So when it comes to the malware specifically, I think everybody in this room has gotten alerts at some point in time that said, your computer's been infected with malware, or it's been infected with this and this and this and this. But what does that really mean? Well, it's able to identify, if you look at traditional kind of alerting systems like a McAfee or something like that, originally it was for very specific signatures or pieces of code that came from specific threat actors. And that's still very much employed and very much in use. But now, as we're getting more involved with the threat actors, I totally lost my point. Where was I going?
We were talking about how these folks actually can purchase.
Oh, yes. So
software.
they can purchase things, right? So if you go into the forums, RAID forums, all of these other forums, you will see tons and tons of information being sold every single day. And that's how a lot of security researchers and threat intelligence companies actually identify what's going on. They just go look and say, okay, what's being sold? And then they will provide that to the organization, or they will reach out to them from that perspective. And while that's a good starting point, that's actually not giving you enough data about that threat actor or where they got the data from. What often happens is, if we're dealing with one of these ransomware conglomerations, which is multiple groups interacting with each other to do the right job, each of them have different skill sets. So there will be some people who are very skilled at writing that particular piece of malware code. And just like anybody who writes anything, just like any artist, they have little signatures in their code. They want to be recognized. They want to be recognized to the point where it's them, but you can't find them and can't arrest them, right? And that's I think that's a hacker ego thing, right? We want the fame.
So some of these bad actors might not even be that technically savvy. They're just purchasing the product, and then they either aim that software at you, or they could pay someone else to just wreak havoc against you. So next time you blow leaves on your neighbor's lawn, he might just pay $50 to give you a bad day, So I guess you have to be careful about that.
That's a good analogy.
So they say 90% of the data is inaccessible, untrusted, and unanalyzed right now. So I guess the only way is to tap into that 90% of the data and start providing some value at that.
Absolutely. So one of our biggest focuses at ShadowByte has been taking the data that we have a lot of data. So our founder has been doing security research for a long time and was a hacker prior to that. And he's into a lot of forums as a threat actor. There are many people that know him as a threat actor, so that he can get close and really talk about this kind of information. So as we're seeing things evolve in terms of those corporations and other things, what we're also seeing is that other people, other companies don't necessarily go that deep into the forums or into the conversations. They're looking more at it from, again, the code perspective or the policy perspective or things of that nature. But once you do start, and there are definitely other companies doing this, once you do start doing that, it really changes the ability for you to get predictive analysis, which is, I think, the goal.
And I assume that the AI systems and frameworks can start looking even at the different aliases that some of these bad actors use as well, and try to actually maybe even unmask some of these folks.
That is our whole goal, really unmasking who the threat actors are. And it's not easy because sometimes you don't get to talk to the threat actor directly. Sometimes you're dealing with friends of friends of friends of criminals of criminals of criminals, and it's thieves among criminals. So what that data is can sometimes be really interesting. But what we're really focusing on is how to do exactly that. We've got some white papers that are going out here in the next couple of weeks and to the Justice Department that are actually talking about how we take the humans piece of threat intelligence and use that as something that's admissible in court, something that can actually be used to get an arrest, that can actually be used for extradition if they're in another country. Because right now, the laws in all the countries are really different. They're very different. For example, Canada's laws on protection of human rights and protection of privacy rights keeps them from actually, arresting several types of cyber criminals. So, for example, and I've heard this quote before, and no reference to a country here, but I've heard this quote before, that we cannot do anything with him unless you have a video of him writing the malware, delivering the malware, and doing it from his home in this location. So when we talk about how we use this in law, how we use this in, bringing cyber criminals to justice, it gets very complicated. But I also think that the AI link here, when we're looking at it from that perspective, can be unchartable. Because if we can really understand and have AI really understanding all of the different global complexities when it comes to legalities, when it comes to policies, when it comes to working together in this specific area, I think we're going to be a lot better in the next 5 years at making sure that we can convict a criminal, right? Right now, some of the challenges that we face are if you just have a malicious code that kind of looks like malicious code that also looks like something these people have done before, making that paper trail, making that IP trail, making that data trail is hard. It's hard, and every country is different. So I really hope that that's kind of evolving or continues to evolve over the next couple of years.
So the skills gap and the vacant positions out for cybersecurity jobs out there, that's reported to be about $2 to $3 million by, I think, 2023, in fact. So, and then I just saw something on CBS News. They reported for 2021, back in May, 500,000 vacant, unfilled jobs. So if you could maybe talk a little bit about, how we start helping.
He knows this is a soapbox of mine, so I apologize. No, I don't apologize. So, a lot of my background is in learning and training, and I'm really a big advocate for generalized, cyber knowledge across the entire population. So that's great. Except that we have these generations that are coming up now who are writing their own AI code. They're writing their own whatever just for fun, and then growing into amazing careers doing that. And that's all fine and dandy. You also have criminals who are doing that too. And, when we talk about your SOC kind of example earlier about how do we use automation to actually take out kind of these lower level tiers, I think that's a mixed bag, because right now people like to say that there are no entry level positions in cybersecurity, which is absolute nonsense. There's lots and lots of entry level jobs out there. And how do you get to become a seasoned SOC analyst? Is it by you're just hired and you're totally seasoned? So this is where I'm conflicted on this issue. I think that we do have to train entry-level people to get into cybersecurity. Otherwise, what is their career path? They can't just get smart overnight. They have to have the experience of doing all of the things that we're asking artificial intelligence and technology to kind of take over. So I think there's a loss in that. What I do think where this can be absolutely critical is in analyzing, the large feeds of data that don't require analysis, perhaps, but require more of an understanding of, first wave attacks or second wave attacks or things of that nature. I think that can be very useful in the future. But when we're talking about the skills gap in general, there's a whole other, line of things that are going on here. I used to work for a company that did gamified training that was actually powered by Watson and natural language processing. And the idea was that inside this training environment, there would be an in-game advisor. And the in-game advisor was learning all of these different types of cybersecurity knowledge, defensive, offensive, general policies, things of that nature, and would be able to answer contextual questions in like real time to help the learner continue to move forward. So, hey, Athena or Barbara or whatever your name is, can you tell me why this particular port is not open? What did I do wrong here? So that each moment can be a teachable and training moment. That's wonderful. I think that's amazing. But just like any other issue with NLP, with machine learning, there has to be enough data to support that. So where do you get enough of that data, that artistic ideology of what cybersecurity is? And this is what I was concerned with before. It is an art form in some cases. So how do you really capture that in a meaningful way to train the next generation of cyber?
So some of the data that's being collected now, I know some stats just from our own organization's perspective, and I've seen some stats that there's about over 89,000 vulnerabilities that are known. There's over 59 billion websites and images that are now being viewed in AI that can bring some of that to the forefront for these analysts. Well, I drew up another backdrop over here with the Ponemon Institute. So there's a cost of a data breach report. That's open, there's no cost for it. We have that available. IBM's one of the sponsors for that Ponemon report. It's ibm.com/security if anyone's interested downloading the report. But something interesting from there, they actually determined from the 537 breaches that they analyzed that the organizations that had AI and automation in their infrastructures actually reduced their payout per breach significantly. So on average, worldwide, the average was over $4 million per incident. Well, in the United States, that's even higher. The average in the United States was about $9 million, according to this report. So the organizations that had the sophisticated tooling of AI actually knocked down their payouts by $3.8 million an incident. So that's pretty significant, and I think that's going to drive a lot of folks to really see the return on investment for that.
I agree, and I had a conversation with Representative Lou Correa from the House of Representatives, who's out in California and has a very interesting district. And what he's really focused on right now, and what we're seeing a lot in congressional movement as well, and how money is moving, AI is definitely a huge part of that. And so we talked about the skills gap previously. Right now, Congress is spending a lot of time and effort and money on not just teaching cybersecurity to young kids and growing a pipeline that way, but really a focus on AI so that once we get to the point where they're joining the workforce, they're really coming in, we have some of the top talent in the world. And I think we know that the AI talent is spread pretty widely across different parts of the world, but really investing money in making sure that we have the best and the brightest when it comes to AI to help think about these kinds of problems.
So the remote workforces that we've all been seeing since the pandemic started, another interesting data point from that Ponemon Institute was that the organizations that were hit that had COVID-based remote workforces actually had an extra $1 million attributed to their remote workforces, which is a little baffling because I would think that that's the trend of everyone is to start working more. In fact, I don't know that a lot of organizations are actually going to go back into the brick and mortar and going to keep them. In fact, we're seeing also talent that's going cross states as well. There's a new title. Well, this title has been around, virtual CISO, vCISO, for a while. But I think it's increasing now because a lot of organizations are not able to have a full-time virtual CISO. So they're going to have these part-time. I'm not even sure how the heck you even balance yourself if you're a virtual CISO, to say, okay, I'm yours now. I'm yours now, and then walk away from those. What happens when there's a situation? You might not get to the second "I'm yours now" when you're tied up for the first one. But so I don't know how the heck they're doing that. But are you seeing that virtual CISO thing?
Yes, definitely.
Evolving?
And honestly, I think this is a great thing for the mid-market businesses, for the small businesses who simply cannot. Right? They have no money to do that. They're on the small business side, they're lucky if they have, a sysadmin or somebody who's doing some kind of security at all. But what we've seen, especially with the supply chain hacks, is that those smaller organizations, those mid-market organizations, are the ones who are providing the key widgets, the key talent, the key whatever into the larger supply chain, community. So if we want to talk about how to really affect that and push that forward, I think that's the use case exactly for that. I've also been seeing virtual SOCs, virtual all of these things, and that's interesting. And I don't have a warm fuzzy about that yet. It just feels like every MSP or MSSP or MRP that we've kind of seen before. But I'm interested, I'm curious to see how that's going to continue to play out, especially when we talk about cost, right? I think a virtual CISO is probably, in my experience, not as expensive as having an MSSP or some other option that's going to try to do security for you. But again, no matter what size your business is, you really need to analyze the need for that. If you're a key widget maker for something for the Department of Defense, or something that, some key technology that secures police officers or whatever it is, then you need to be aware of that situation. You need to know how you fit into the larger supply chain issue.
I've been seeing a trend evolving. I've been around for a long time, and I could tell you that a lot of the larger organizations, security vendors, with the broad portfolios, at one point in the past, would try to get their clients to buy into the whole suite, the whole stack. And the premise was that if you bought into our stack, then, first of all, things won't crash and burn because they've at least been validated to at least operate in the same silos. Whether or not they were consumers and suppliers to another is another factor, but at least they wouldn't break things down. On the being consumers and suppliers to one another, that was something that was a strategy for these vendors to start getting some of their siloed security controls. By the way, Ponemon Institute surveyed about 3,000 organizations, and I think almost every organization came up and said they, even though they had 40 different individual security controls, needed more of them. And that brings a lot of different stuff, subject matter experts, contracts, everything. So when you get to now with things starting to work together, but that utopia never was arrived. So the next generation that these vendors are moving towards nowadays is called XDR, Extended Detection and Response platforms, where it's bring your own security, and they'll overlay a framework on top of that where they'll start working and they'll start bringing in the advanced analytics, the AI, and so forth. So are you seeing that trend as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. When you start thinking about traditional MSSPs, as a security person and a hacking mindset, they're just a big target, right? So if you have all of these things in your full stack of security and they're all in one place, and oh, by the way, that MSSP is also servicing 50, Fortune 500 companies, and it just makes them a giant target. So being able to be mobile, being able to be elastic when it comes to when you bring people in and when you don't, and who you do that for, is an entire art form of itself, right? Mm-hmm. Being able to show that you're doing some things, but not show everything that you're doing, and not having the exact same stack in multiple kind of vendors or customer situations. And I think SolarWinds is a great example of that. When everybody has the same tech stack, that is going to lead you to being under attack because it's popular and people know that they're using it.
Now, there used to be a term, security by obscurity, and it was ridiculous because you could hide things, and then everyone realized that there's no way to hide all the stuff. But according to the data breach report that just came out, the folks with hybrid clouds fared much better than the ones that had cloud environments. But hybrid specifically was about $3.8 million lower as well, if I remember correctly. And I guess that is because you have your stuff scattered all over the place. So it was harder for the bad actors maybe to get to everything. So you reduce some of your risk and your liability. But on the other hand, it included challenges for you to find your data across everything. So how are organizations doing that with that AI and trying to go?
So there's a really interesting kind of shift in thinking when it comes to this. And it's about privacy, right? We're seeing a lot of companies like Apple, for example, coming out and saying that the data that they're going to process from Siri, the data that Amazon has not come out to do this yet, but I know they're working on some policies that are going to do this. But having the AI data only stored on your device. So that helps a little bit with the situation of the timeliness and how rapidly they can make decisions and do things like that. What it also does, though, from a privacy perspective, is make sure that your data is not your communications with the AI, your communications with the voice assistants is not going back to their larger warehouse of data and being used for other things. Now, there are other companies, and I won't call them all out, but who do exactly the same thing, but they take all of that data into their data centers and use it to create customer profiles, and that data is then extremely useful to marketers and research firms and ... So artificial intelligence in that way, I think we're going to start getting closer to what Europe is doing with GDPR when it comes to protecting your data. I hope we're going to do that. I know the FTC was looking at getting, I think, $10 million over the next 5 years to build out a data privacy organization that would actually kind of, chair all of this. I personally think that needs to sit within CISA now that CISA has kind of control of that. But I think companies need to get more cognizant of the privacy issues that they're going to face with these massive products that go out that are AI focused, NLP focused, deep learning focused, and it kind of scares me. I have my next door neighbor has Alexa in every single room in her house. And I was over there the other day and she said, "Why are the lights always green on this thing?" I was like, "Because it's recording."
Oh boy.
She said, "Well, what would it be recording?" And I was like, "Oh, honey."
Oh my goodness.
But being able to understand, most people don't understand the security risks, the privacy risks of all of the new technology that's coming out in voice assistants and these other types of AI. And I think that is where, from a consumer perspective, consumers need to get smarter on what's really happening with their data. Now, when you talk about, pushing into edge computing, that's really where that split of data makes a lot of sense. Computing power, trying to protect the data, but also recognizing that there's just not enough, kind of juice to keep sending that back. Also, it opens you up to liabilities from privacy.
There was something just right on, I don't know if anyone caught 60 Minutes last Sunday night, but they had someone from China talking about how, and they were interviewing them about collecting all of that data. And anyone that's doing business in China, you have to give up all of your data, your source code as well as your data. And they're being very upfront that they said data is the new frontier. And I know IBM has said that for years as well, that organizations would have a competitive advantage for the ones that could actually have superior analytics over the data. But China, is being upfront and just saying, yeah, we're taking everything and we're going to use that.
Yeah, and I think, thankfully, as an American, our policies are a little bit more strict when it comes to that. I think they could be better. As a consumer, I think they could be better. What's also really interesting when we start thinking about all of these countries that have all of these, different policies for privacy and things of that nature is, what is it that we want? Let's just use the US, let's just use America. What is it that we want out of our data? What is it that we want to be shared about us? What is it that we're comfortable being out there in the real world? And I know that gets to be a tough question when you have 9 million passwords on 50 different accounts, and you're juggling your banks and you're juggling all of these things. And then you have a remote assistant in your home who's connecting your refrigerator to your stove and then asking you if you want to set the alarm because they noticed that the refrigerator, this interconnected world that we live in right now. We as Americans have to start looking at what we want that to be for us, what we want that to do for us, and where we draw the line in terms of the protection of who we are. This gets really difficult with artificial intelligence and how it's being used. So for example, if we're just talking about a voice assistant or a chat bot, I'll use a telecom company just right off the top of my head. And you go in and you try to ask for support, right? And then when you're asking for support, it pops up the AI or the chat bot that's trying to communicate with you in a different way. This particular one I experienced just a couple of weeks ago. So when you do threat intelligence, bad guys like to try to hack your system all the time, and they spam you and they send you all of this stuff because they're jerks like that. And so this was happening, and I called customer service to try to get some assistance, and I told them exactly what was happening. I was like, what's happening is I'm getting email to text spam from like global terrorists, and they're being really jerks about it. Right now I have like 6,000 of them on my phone, and they're coming in like crazy. I want to talk to somebody in your threat intel team. We don't do threat intel. I was like, I'm sorry, what? I actually know that not to be true. So I worked my way through 15 different layers of people to get to the person that's in charge of this particular issue, which is a known issue in the company. And they say, we've been putting that, like on the stack for the developers to do for like a year, and they just haven't gotten around to it. I'm like, wait a minute. So you're telling me it's Christmas time, first of all. Everybody's shopping. Everybody's doing all of these things. It took me an hour, 2 hours to get to talk to a person, to get to talk to other people. So when you're using these kind of chatbots, when you're using things that are customer facing like this, that's a whole other issue. Do they want to continue to go through the frustration of, no, that's not what I want. Right. Option number 2. No, I said option number 2. There's frustration in that.
Sure.
So I think that's another piece of it too, when we talk about what we're willing to accept, what we're not willing to accept, what's okay, what's not okay. It's great that we're pushing the digital frontier when it comes to artificial intelligence and NLP and machine learning, but you have to weigh the balance between it making your organization more efficient versus making it more cumbersome for the users. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a struggle that a lot of companies are having right now, and not just security companies, but all companies.